And here's another real life story. It's been a while since I've recorded any. This is a very disruptive time of my life. I was in my early to mid 20s. I had graduated from Rutgers University May of 1974 and went back home living with my parents until somewhere around maybe May of 1975, something like that. Since I really didn't know what I wanted to do, I didn't have a particular vocation coming out of college. I had worked one summer with a county planning board, and I became disheartened listening to the professionals who worked there as they laughed about all of their studies and research and reports that were never going to be looked at, but they had a nice paying job. And I determined at that time that I would rather pump gas. It was more real than what these clowns were doing. So anyway, I was living at home with my parents in Middletown, New Jersey, and really didn't know what I was going to do. Ultimately, I was a part-time assistant ground crew for a tree surgeon. I was also a part-time guitar teacher at Mr. Lowy's music shop. I was also a part-time substitute teacher in the Middletown township area until one day I was teaching a ninth grade. I was substituting for a ninth grade shop class, and I don't know what period it was, maybe second or third period, and excuse me, and I was simply taking attendance. That's all I was doing, and a couple of disruptive kids were throwing spitballs or paper or whatever back and forth in the classroom, and I was doing my best to try to stop that. At some point, I called one of them up, the guy that I thought was the primary troublemaker, and while he's standing next to me, and while I'm continuing to take attendance, from right next to me, he threw something at someone. I dropped the attendance book and came around on this ninth grader. I almost hit a ninth grader, and at that point I realized that I really didn't have what it took to be a teacher. I was not wired in that way. I'm way too emotional, and I certainly at that time took things far too personally. But I almost decked a ninth grader, believe it or not. And I've never been in a fight. Eighth grade, John David Horisco was bothering me one day, a guy that I knew from my classes. And he was just, hey, Bert, hey, Bert, hey, Bert, leave me alone, Horisco. Hey, Bert, hey, Bert. So out at gym, he kept this nonsense up, and I never used my fists, so I jumped up in the air and kicked him in the chest. And he went down like a sack of potatoes, and that was the end of it. So I've never really been in a fight. And here I almost decked a ninth grader. Anyway, at some point, living with my parents and working these different part-time jobs, I realized I needed to move. I had to get out. But oh God, where? Please, praying for clarity. What would I be doing? Where would I go? I was considering seriously, perhaps just on my own, moving to Wyoming and maybe go be a ski bum out there. And I believe it was May of 1975, I took a solo trip up to New Hampshire, headed for Tuckerman's Ravine on Mount Washington. And it was only the second time I'd ever been there. I'd been there in, I guess, 1973. And anyway, on the way back from Tuckerman's Ravine, I stopped in Hillsboro, New Hampshire, to see Lori and Jim Wilcoxon. And I told them I was considering moving out to Wyoming. And they were like, why would you go out there? You don't know anybody. You wouldn't have any place to stay. I'll tell you what, why don't you come up here and stay with us while you figure it out? It sounded like a heck of a good offer, so probably within 3 or 4 weeks, I packed up my '66 Oldsmobile station wagon, and I drove up to visit Jim and Lori, and I was tenting on their property. I think they owned 7 acres at that time, and he had built the house, and while he was building their house, he had deconstructed a chicken coop and rebuilt it on the property so that he and Lori could live there. But now they had a house and they were living in there. So after tenting for a while on their property, I moved into what Jim affectionately called the white trash house. And I lived in there, and it was a very healing time. It was good to be out on my own. It was good to be with people I knew, somewhat watching over me. I also wound up writing a very complex song called Sabbath Rest, which is on my CD. I wrote that while living in the white trash house, and I still like that song an awful lot. While I was living up in New Hampshire, I ultimately got a job at Camp Wadiko. It was a summer camp for emotionally disturbed kids, primarily out of Boston area. And I loved it. I really loved it. Working with these kids and writing reports and interacting with fellow counselors. I guess I was a camp counselor. When that summer was over, I was crushed. It really hurt. It hurt so much. I remember driving across the bridge and pulling over because I could no longer see. I was just weeping and weeping. Ultimately, I decided I better go back to New Jersey, see my folks, and also spend some time with Mark Reed, who was working at Bonnie Bray. It was a residential center for emotionally disturbed kids. It was in Basking Ridge, New Jersey. Mark introduced me to the director. We both knew him from First Christian Assembly, where we both had been attending ever since our conversions back at Rutgers. And so I wound up getting a job at one of the cottages there on the Bonnie Bray campus. And that lasted, I think, from, let's say, maybe September until early or mid-December. And I talk about what happened there when I got jumped by a 14-year-old, very big, very strong black kid. And that was the end of my time working for Bonnie Bray. I had 2 weeks to get off the campus. And I talk about that in another real-life story called The Vision 1975. It really did happen to me. I don't want to go through it again here. But I reached out to the elders at First Christian Assembly, where I was attending, and they directed me perhaps to go and meet with Rick Best. He had an apartment. It was one of the weirdest houses I've ever seen. 2 stories tall, 4 rooms total. Weird. But he was willing to have a roommate. So, okay, what the heck. So I moved in with him, and that was thanks to the elders at First Christian Assembly. I think I probably spent about 9 months living there with Rick. And I was dating Glenda, who was Rick's neighbor and who lived in the next building over, and she was above the landlord for all of us. He owned all the property right there. His name was Al, and a couple of different times while visiting Glenda, we heard Al, a phone would ring and he'd pick it up, yeah, and then the next thing you know, a string of expletives at full volume. I don't know who the heck he was talking to. He was very Italian. And I think he had some pressures from who knows where. But it sure seemed like he was being pressured by people that he didn't know or he didn't like or something. Anyway, one day I came home from work. Where was I working? I guess I had started. No. I'm not sure, to tell you the truth. Sorry. One day I came home from work and Al was outside kicking dirt and stones at Rick and my house and yelling. Yelling at what? I don't know. It was insane. It seemed like a psychotic breakdown. I tried to talk with him, and he turned his anger at me, and I rushed into the house just to get away from this nut. He truly was nuts. Excuse me. Excuse me. Rick came home, and Rick tried, he was still going on 2 hours later. Rick came home, and this guy was still out there yelling at the air, kicking stones, kicking dirt. It was weird. Rick tried to talk to him, and he also went nuts again. At that point, I realized this is out of control, and I called the cops. Al had a scanner, so he heard his address and that he was going to avoid them. So he got control and sat down on his porch and was sitting in a chair when the cops arrived, and a sergeant and either corporal or a private, the two of them got out, and I heard the sergeant say, "Al, what's going on?" Nothing's going on. And the sergeant spent a few minutes trying to wrestle out what was wrong, and he and the corporal started to get back in the car, and I went out. Al went crazy in front of the cops. They took him away in handcuffs, obviously, and I realized that I had to leave this apartment where I'd been living for, 6 to 9 months. I needed to get out, and I needed to get out tonight. So praying, what do I do? What do I do? Where do I go? While Al is in jail, I reached out to the church elders, and they put me in touch with this lovely couple, Ed and Louine Eck. The elder that I was dealing with, can't remember the name right now, sorry. But he owned a jewelry store in downtown Plainfield, and Ed worked part-time for him. And Ed also worked for the Logos Journal, which was a Christian publication out of Plainfield, charismatic Christian publication out of Plainfield, New Jersey. They lived on Belvedere Avenue in this huge, gorgeous Victorian house. And by that night, after interviewing with Ed and Louine, I moved into the Belvedere house. That'll be it for this part of the story.